Welcome to Vermont Today. I'm Terence Jeroloman, your host, and my two guests this time are Linda Waite-Simpson and Marnie Wood. Marnie Wood is on the board of Patient Choices Vermont, and Linda Waite-Simpson is working for Compassion and Choices, and we're going to discuss the Death with Dignity in Vermont. Marnie, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background?
Yes, I came to Vermont to visit my sister 31 years ago and decided to stay. I was raised in San Diego, but I have New England roots, and I've been an elementary educator for more than 30 years. And when I retired, I helped care for my sister, and her journey has brought me to be a strong advocate for this legislation.
But your sister lived in Oregon after.
She became a resident of Oregon. She lived here for 9 years. I came to visit her in 1983 and decided to stay, and she and her family moved from the state in 1989. During her journey with ALS, she did live with me for a while, and I was her caregiver here, and then she returned to her residence in Oregon, and she hastened the end of her life there.
Yes. And Linda, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. I am currently the State Director for Compassion and Choices, and Compassion and Choices is a national organization that advocates for full choice and control at the end of life. I am also a 3-term sitting legislator in the State House and currently on the House Judiciary Committee. I was intimately involved in this bill, both as a legislator and personally. It's been an honor to be able to bring this information to people in the state of Vermont. I moved here in 1998 with my very young children and husband at the time, and have lived here for the last 15 years. Been very involved in my community, school board work, lots of committee work, volunteering, and it's been just an absolute pleasure to live here in the state of Vermont.
You moved here in 1998?
Yes, I did.
Where were you from originally?
Originally, I was born in Florida, in Miami, Florida, and I grew up there. I lived in New York City and Westchester County, New York, just prior to moving here. I was in that area for about 12 years, and prior to that was in Alaska for about 5 years. So I've been and seen a lot of this great country of ours, and just absolutely thrilled to be here in Vermont. It seems like home to me, and I hope to be here for the duration.
I'm originally from Rockland County, New York, which is just across the river
Yes.
from Westchester.
Yes.
And I left there in 1997.
Okay. Well, we came here about the same time then.
Yes, but in the between, I moved to Albany, New York, and then I moved here. Compassion and Choices, that's a national organization, right?
Yes, it is. We have about 60,000 members nationwide. We provide end-of-life consultation services that are absolutely free to anybody who calls our 800 number. And basically, we just think it's very important for people to understand what their options are, legal options, and sometimes they just need some help in sorting through things that are in an advance directive, or they may need some help in understanding how to speak to their physician about what their death may be like if they're facing a terminal illness. Sometimes families need to understand what their support options are, and so we do counsel people, and we also provide clinical support for physicians who are working with their patients.
In Oregon, you have an official position, don't you, that Compassion and Choices represents the state, I think that I read?
Right, I'm the state director for Vermont, and they do have a presence in just about every state in the country. They have three national offices, one in Washington, D.C., one in Denver, Colorado, and one in Portland, Oregon. And so they have a very robust organization in Oregon because they have been, they're the state with the longest standing death with dignity law, so they've had much more time to set up their network and their structure and their organization in that state. It has been the law in Washington state for 8 years, and so they have also had a bit of time to set up their network and structure. So Vermont's very new to this law. We've had this law for about 1.5 years here, and we're still in the process of connecting physicians and connecting clinical support, and also making sure that Vermonters understand what their rights are under our laws.
Is Compassion and Choices totally funded by voluntary contributions, or
Yes, it is,
there's
absolutely.
no tax funding?
There is no contribution from the state of Vermont to Compassion and Choices whatsoever.
But in Oregon there is, right?
In Oregon, they are actually have a fund set up within their tax structure to pay for death with dignity services that are not covered under Medicare, because there is a federal prohibition for federal funds to go to support this work. And so they do have a fund set up within the state of Oregon to cover that.
So how did Compassion and Choices come to decide to support aid in dying?
Well, Compassionate Choices goes back to originally to what's known today as the Hemlock Society, and they became very active during the AIDS epidemic. They were contacted by a number of parents whose children were, adult children were afflicted with this then unknown disease, and really there was very little help that was forthcoming from the medical community. And the parents were seeing their adult children dying in really terrible ways, and so the Hemlock Society was really came to the forefront during that epidemic to work with these patients so that they could have a dignified and peaceful and humane death. It has changed names and iterations over the years, and it is now called Compassion and Choices. And we do support aid in dying because it is by far a comfort for people to understand what their options are, and to know that this option is available to them should the time come and they feel that they need to have to help to hasten their death. And so we are an advocate for people having that choice and control. It's a very patient-centered concept in terms of controlling your death.
And last year, the Vermont legislature passed the Death with Dignity bill. So it's actually part of the law here in Vermont now, right?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
May 20th, May 13th, 2013. Can we
May
go back?
13,
May
2013.
20th, 2013.
It was signed into law
It was
on May
signed into
20th.
law, right.
So that's over a year now that we've had experience with it.
That's true. And, it's very interesting because I'm just going to go a little sidetrack here to Quebec. Quebec just passed their Death with Dignity bill and signed it into law, and they gave themselves 18 months to implement the bill, to implement the practice, to get people trained, to set up their networks, and to make sure that people understood what was available to them. Vermont had an immediate implementation death, and so it was a little more difficult going out of the gate because nobody really quite knew nobody knew what to do. There was no real clinical training available at that point, and so Compassionate Choices came into the state and did rounds around the state to talk to physicians about the clinical aspects of this. We are now engaged in a very robust effort to educate Vermonters about what their rights are under the law, and we also continue to support physicians who need clinical assistance in helping their patients. So the interesting thing about Vermont is that we had no period of time to really work on the implementation before the law took effect. So right out of the gate, a lot of organizations said, we're not going to participate in this until we have a full discussion of what the policy is going to look like within our medical organization. And so there was a bit of a lag in actually getting the law implemented, and we're still setting those networks up today. And I think if you look at Washington State, this last year, the numbers of people participating really went up dramatically, and I think it really does take that 5 to 6 year period to implement the law very well and to make sure that people are trained and understand what they have to do and what the requirements are and the clinical aspects of it as well.
So educating Vermonters is part of why we're doing this show, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And understanding how to speak with your physician about this. If you think that this might be an option, for you at the end of your life and you're not sick yet, it's still a good idea to have this conversation with your physician to understand what their values are and to make sure that you're aligned in your values. Sometimes when you wait until you're within the scope of the law, which is within 6 months of your death, you're already so far into a relationship with a physician that if they're not aligned with this, it would be very difficult to change medical providers at that point. So we do encourage people to have this conversation with their physicians early on, and that they can then make whatever choices they need to make about their medical care. We do have a document online on the Compassion and Choices Vermont website page, where it does give you some information on how you can, just some tips on how you can speak to your physician about this option, and some information on maybe some red flags if certain answers come back to you from your physician that you may want to press a little bit farther. We do recognize that there are physicians whose values are not aligned with hastening death, and so that is completely understandable, and we did give those physicians immunity under the law as well. But I think there's an expectation within the medical community that if you're not going to participate, that you will minimally refer your patient to some other physician or provider who will work with them.
So we're here in Burlington, Vermont, and as someone who wants to make use of the law, is it easy for them to find a physician in Burlington, or is that a problem here in Chittenden County too?
Well, I think there are some pockets of the state where it's going to be more difficult to find a physician. If you look at like the Upper Valley, for instance, where a lot of the medical community is out of Dartmouth, Hitchcock, which is in New Hampshire, and they don't have immunity under our laws. They're operating out of New Hampshire. So I think there are going to be pockets of the state where this is going to continue to be kind of a struggle for some people. But in Chittenden County, down in Middlebury, the center of the state, certainly we have a fairly robust support of the law. Many physicians are very willing to work with their own patients. Physicians are not necessarily willing to take on other physicians' patients. So that's been a little bit of a struggle, trying to find referrals for people who just are kind of at the end of their physician being able to help them. But here in Chittenden County, we have a fairly robust system of referrals, and it is a peer-to-peer network. There's no list of physicians, so you can't go and find out who is supporting or not supporting. That is certainly a private position that a physician is entitled to. And so we encourage people to have the conversation privately with their physician to understand what those parameters are going to be as they move into the aging community and maybe facing terminal illness themselves.
You were talking about Quebec. Quebec has a long connection with the Catholic Church. I lived in Montreal for a while, and the church is very strong there. And I wonder if how that affects the law. Is their law as comprehensive as ours, or is it more restrictive?
Well, very interestingly, the Quebec law actually requires the physician to administer the prescription. So the patient has to ask for it, but the physician has to give the patient the prescription. So it's much closer to the European version of the law, which some people call euthanasia, but it's kind of a hybrid in that the patient does have to ask for it. If a physician in Montreal or in Quebec decides that they don't want to participate, they are obligated under that law to find a referral for their patients. So it's a little different from what we are doing here in this country. In this country, you have to be able to self-ingest, you have to be able to swallow, you have to be able to, to be in control at that step. So it's a little different from the Quebec law. Catholic Church is very strong in Quebec, which I find very intriguing and interesting. But I was speaking to a physician who was trained up at McGill, and he said, if you look at this in terms of choice, and in reproductive rights in particular, the abortion issue, at McGill, every single physician is trained how to perform an abortion. And that is just an expected part of your practice. In the United States, you actually have to go seek out that training. It is not provided as a routine matter. And so, it's a very different approach to educating the medical community even. So my guess is what they are doing right now at the medical schools in the Quebec area is that they are figuring out how to incorporate this into the curriculum, and it will become a part of it, just like performing abortions has become a part of their medical curriculum.
McGill, though, is the English university in Montreal.
Yes.
And the University of Montreal caters more to the French community. So there's a balance there.
Yes.
The Catholic Church is much stronger in the French community.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So I have no, honestly, I have no idea how it was just a complete surprise to me that they passed this law. But I do think that there are a lot of progressive Catholics who may not choose this for themselves, but they don't necessarily want to be the people making this choice for other people. And by saying no to it for everybody, you're making that choice for other people. So I do think that there's a growing number of people who say, this is not for me, but I'm not going to make that decision for somebody else. That is up to them to make that choice.
Last year, before testifying before the legislature about this bill, I read a book here that covers the worldwide the issue of death with dignity. And it's very interesting. You mentioned the European system and how Quebec has followed that more closely. But in 4 countries in Europe, they have a very strong death with dignity bill. Switzerland and Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg. And but only Switzerland will cover non-residents. All the others limited to residents.
Right.
I wonder if in Quebec it's limited to residents, or they allow Americans to go up there.
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that,
Yeah.
Unfortunately. But the interesting thing that's going on in right now is that the British Parliament is actually considering a death with dignity bill, an aid in dying bill. And so, it's really gaining momentum, I think, across not only states here in this country, but in other countries as well. I mean, it's considered a right to be able to control your death and to make this decision in the privacy of your physician's office and not have other groups or religions or government interfere in that decision-making process.
This might be a good time to bring Marnie into the conversation. Your sister made use of the death with dignity bill a few years ago.
Yes, she did. 5 years ago, she hastened the end of her life. She had ALS, and she made that courageous choice, and it was completely acceptable within our family. We supported her. We had cared for her in her journey. Initially, we did not know exactly what was happening to her body, but I think, well, perhaps some people do not have the familiarity that I have, having accompanied her through her journey, but the decline in the mobility is really severe. I know that some people are very aware that there are certain well-known persons who have had ALS and continue to have life for much longer than certainly my sister was able to. But the standard diagnosis is that a person diagnosed with ALS will die within 3 to 5 years. And for Nancy, that she fell specifically right into that range. She'd been extremely healthy, very conscious. 5 children in our family. I'd say we're all health conscious, but that she was really the one who specifically knew everything about nutrition and activity, and she was very healthy. In fact, she remained vibrant in her being. So through those final months, her spirit was so clearly there, but she progressively was losing her ability to speak, and then ultimately the muscles are compromised in terms of your breathing activity and swallowing, and so she was diagnosed within 6 months of death and was very clear with her intent. Prior to that point, because she had resided in Oregon and was familiar with the law, certainly, as many of us, Linda mentioned, that it's good to start having conversations with your physicians. And I know we tend to think, but I believe I'm a long way from that point that I would need to have a conversation. But in point of fact, as I said, my sister was extremely healthy, and then slowly she lost the use of her, more or less the right side of her body, her right arm and leg. And then at first they thought it was MS, which ALS can mask as MS. And so we were seeing physicians around that. And she was a strong believer in Eastern medicine as well. So she was very active, I guess is what I wanted to say. She's very active in trying to understand what was going on and deal with it and figure out ways in which we could make accommodations. Well, obviously, I think you can tell I respect the spirit that she maintained throughout. Not that every day was a joyous one, but she really looked towards eventually how her life and death could have an impact. And so it's one of the main reasons that I'm involved in this. But I have to say that being that observer, helping to care for her, working with the rest of the family. My mother is still alive. She was 89 when Nancy died. And 5 years ago, mother was very supportive as well. So that generation, I was worried it might not be of her initial desire, but she saw the deterioration in health and the compromise. Nancy was unable to do anything for herself. And so that level of making a choice, and she was grateful that Oregon had the law and that she was a resident and could make a choice to hasten the end of her life.
It was fortunate that she had moved to Oregon earlier from Vermont, because if she had stayed in Vermont, she would not have been, what would have happened if she had stayed in Vermont?
Exactly. Well, she came to visit me. I know I mentioned earlier that I had come to visit her and decided to stay. As she was in the stage of still not knowing exactly what was wrong with her, she came to visit me because she still had friends in the area. And during that time, it was clear that she was becoming more and more compromised with her movement and so forth. As she was able, when she had lost the use of her right hand, of course she taught herself to eat with her left hand, and then we were seeing the deterioration of that side of her body as well. And so the diagnosis, first of all, she stayed longer than she had intended because, in point of fact, her health was becoming worse. And I was caring for her. I had retired from my teaching position. And in caring for her, then we were having conversations about, what could this be that's going on? And she, at one point, said, I don't know exactly. Obviously, we don't know exactly at this point. But because she had been a resident of Oregon, she was grateful and very aware. And so her two children also resided in Oregon, and that was another compelling reason for her to return to Oregon. And then within, a few months, she was seen by a neurologist who we'd had the diagnosis here of ALS, and she saw a neurologist in Portland who determined that she was progressing at a rate that she was within 6 months of dying. And so the procedure, she'd made her decision already. The physician under Oregon law is, when they are seeing a patient who is terminal, then they are compelled to have that conversation about the possibility, if the patient was aware of the law and the ability to hasten their death. And so, of course, that conversation transpired, and Nancy was very aware. So it was not news to her. And then the procedure started. Obviously, she was considering when she might choose. She wanted to hold off as long as she could. And so that became our awareness of she needed to make that volitional act of swallowing the medication and ending her life. And so as things were progressing, that she was finding it more difficult to speak, that was an indicator that she would begin to lose that ability to swallow. So our family, as I said, was very supportive, and because her children and other members of the family were able to be with her, we all are very comforted in our grief around her death, because we know it was her choice and we supported her in that. And as I said, now my advocacy work is because of my journey with her, but also because I believe so strongly that each person should have that individual right of choice. As Linda was mentioning, there are other choices in terms of how we may go through to the end time of our life, but this legislation allows or adds on an additional choice, and I'm such an advocate for each person's right of choice, not to impose it on someone else, but we should be guaranteed that right of choice. So that's why I've been working and continue to work in terms of, we have the legislation now, we want to protect each citizen's right of choice in the state of Vermont, and we want the bill to be protected, so I'm a strong advocate for that as we move through into our successive legislative sessions. And it's very important work for me.
Last year, when the bill was up for consideration, I was there for all the debates, and I testified before the committees in both houses about one of the considerations that at that time was that people with ALS and Alzheimer's would not be covered by the bill because of the fact that you had to be mentally able to make the decision within 6 months. And that wiped out the Alzheimer's patients. And then the ALS patients, they thought that, well, perhaps they would not be able to take the medicine themselves. And I think most people at that time thought that it meant picking it up with your hand and drinking it. But as you alluded to, the fact that all you have to do is be able to swallow. So someone can bring the glass up to your mouth with a straw, and if you can suck it in and swallow it, then you're fine.
Yes, it's clearly, I mean, I imagine some people might be sitting there swallowing, listening to us talk here and realizing when we swallow, that is our own complete volitional act, and therefore it's so primary and does allow an ALS patient who's, for those who are not aware of ALS, there's no compromising of the brain. My sister was alert, active in terms of the brain. It's both a positive and, you might say, it's a negative when you have all that thinking time knowing that you're dying, but obviously you have plenty of thinking time and ability to continue to be actively engaged and make the decision. That's the most important thing. It was totally her voluntary decision to make that. And I think that we know the length of time in Oregon, and all the data points to how successful in terms of a person's right of choice this particular legislation has been, and that there's been really almost no, I mean, Linda, you might be able to speak to that better than I, but the data shows that everything has been done appropriately. The Compassion and Choice organization in Oregon were supportive of our journey because Nancy was there, and I couldn't speak. I could speak for a long time about how wonderfully supportive they were of not only my sister in what was her end-of-life choice, but the family as well, and informative. The woman that met with us is just still a very important person in our life, because she had such compassion and care and gave such informative support. She was a nurse and knew the medical side, but she also really had that wonderful, compassionate aspect of assisting in this particular endeavor.
But ALS doesn't affect all people in the same way. There's often it starts with the legs. For instance, Henry Wallace. I don't know if people realize the former Vice President of the United States died of ALS, and so did Jacob Javits, a former U.S. Senator in New York. And I think they were both affected. The extremities were affected first, but there's something called bulbous ALS, which affects your throat. It begins in your throat. So for those patients, they wouldn't perhaps be able to swallow, even at the beginning stages of the disease. So they might not be covered.
They might not be covered, but what's also considered self-ingestion is that if you have a feeding tube, it is self-ingestion. If you can use your hands at that point but not swallow, you can actually inject the solution into your feeding tube. So legally, that is a protected activity as well. It's considered self-ingestion as long as you are controlling either through swallowing or using your hands to do the injection into your feeding tube.
That's a good point.
So some of the other, Marnie brought up the whole issue, and you were talking a little bit earlier about the Alzheimer's patients and how they're kind of blocked out of this because of the competency requirements under the law. I just want to talk a little bit about the law. In Vermont, you have to be a Vermont resident, and we purposely left that definition loose because we wanted physicians to be able to consider any number of elements when they're treating their patients. It is not enough to own property in the state of Vermont to be a resident. You actually have to have a homestead exemption, or you have to file income taxes, or you have to vote here, or you have to have a driver's license here. So there are a number of elements that physicians have to go through when they're treating their patients to ensure that you truly are a Vermont resident. You have to be within 6 months. You have to have a diagnosis that says that you are within 6 months of dying. That has to be confirmed by a second physician. You have to be determined to be competent to make this choice. And so if there's a question about whether you have clinical depression or something like that, you have to be referred to for a psychiatric evaluation to ensure that you are competent. So for Alzheimer's patients, it's really important to understand that it's a very slowly progressing disease for most people, and that by the time you are within 6 months of dying, you do not have the competency to be able to make this choice. But there are other things that people can do to ensure that they are not left in a lingering state past when they want to be alive. And so you can, in your advance directive, direct your caregivers to stop feeding you and giving you fluids when you get to the point where you can't do that on your own, and you really don't know who you are, you don't know who people are around you, you don't recognize your family any longer. So you can make those provisions in your advance directive, and you can say that when I get to that point, I am going to insist that I not be fed or given fluids, and that further, because the sucking reflex is so strong that just because I might display that reflex does not mean that I want you to feed me. So it's a really particularly explicit terms that you have to put into your advance directive to make that clear, that people may stop feeding and giving you fluids at that point.
The question of residence is pretty important because the majority of the states don't allow death with dignity, and so many people in other parts of the country may want to move to a state. But in Vermont, suppose someone moves here from Texas, and they the first day they arrive, they could register to vote. and apply for a driver's license. So within 2 weeks, they could become a resident.
That's absolutely true.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think it will be difficult if you are already in medical care for terminal disease. It may be difficult to find a physician who will take over that care and then prescribe for you as well. And so we really advise people not to move to Vermont, to utilize the law. If they believe they want to become a Vermonter, that's absolutely fine. But it may be difficult to find a physician willing to work with you if you are really at that end stage of your life.
In Oregon, though, I think they require that you be there a year before they will recognize you as a resident.
I have to be perfectly honest with you that when all of this came forward for Nancy, she had already been a resident for a number of years.
But she never changed her residence to Vermont.
Well, she certainly, in terms of as she was declining, she was with me for a period of time and I was her caregiver, but she had that prior residence. And so it happened that when she returned, she was legally within the right of having been a resident and was a resident, a returned resident, I guess. I'm sorry, I don't know the whole parameters around that because we were busy just being with her and dealing with her.
She was
But
probably just a
right,
visitor. So.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, you do have to take some action to change your residency. So either registering to vote or getting the driver's license, whatever those actions are, it is a specific step that you have to take to become a resident. So filing taxes even, it can be an indicator of where your residency is.
But for people that want to move to Vermont, it's easy to do that part. The hard part is finding a physician that will accept you.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's hard in general, I think.
Yeah.
We can chuckle about that, but I know I've had people move here and I've met them in the Middlebury area and it can be tough depending on where you're located in this state just to have a physician in general,
But if you're in
more so in
Chittenden
this.
County, it's not that difficult.
that may be.
I think physicians are very supportive in Chittenden County. I think finding a physician who has available space within their patient volume.
Yes,
that's
that's
I think what Marnie was talking
Yes,
about.
that's what I was referring
That just
to.
finding a doctor in general sometimes can be a challenge in this state. If you go down to the Bennington area, they have a real shortage of primary care physicians, and it's just hard to find a doctor in general, let alone a doctor who may, work with you in this end-of-life option. That's a completely separate layer that's put on top of the lack of primary care in general in some areas of the state.
Well, in Burlington, we have the Community Health Center. I think our Senator Bernie Sanders has been very good about getting funding for the community centers all around the state. But at the Burlington Center on Riverside Avenue, there are physician's assistants. I think there are more physician's assistants than there are actual physicians. They work under the supervision of a physician. I wonder, does that solve the problem that one of them could write the prescription?
Not under the Vermont law.
No.
It is strictly
Oh.
physicians, and doctors of osteopathy are permitted to prescribe as well, but those are the two groups that are permitted to write this prescription. So you do have to be under the direct care of a physician or DO.
But if you are seeing a physician's assistant, you still are under the direct care of a physician because the assistant works for the physician. Wouldn't that count?
Well, a physician assistant can typically write a prescription, but not this prescription. So the patient would actually have to be with the physician themselves.
That's a rather severe restriction because in Vermont, the assistants are highly trained and they do a lot of the primary health care. So you're really restricting it if you're not allowing them to write the prescription.
Yeah, absolutely. It was one of the compromises we made. There were a number of compromises that we made when we were working on the bill as it worked its way through the legislative process. And it was important for some people to have this confined to physicians and not to expand that to other prescribing groups. So it is the law here. So that's what we have to work with at this point.
And you were talking about Alzheimer's patients. at the end, they can, with their advance directive, they can tell their healthcare provider that they don't want to be artificially fed or hydrated. But one of the reasons for the Death with Dignity bill is that many people have experienced extreme pain at the end of life. And especially cancer patients, the medication has not been able to alleviate that. And even if morphine will alleviate it theoretically, there's always times when they're late delivering the medicine, or the nurse in the hospital forgets, and so the patient ends up in this extreme pain when they only have a few weeks left to live anyway. So why should they have to suffer this? But your answer for the Alzheimer patient, if you're going to cause them to die of thirst or starve to death, I think there's pain involved there too, or extreme discomfort.
For some, there may be, yes. I mean, I think it's everybody's experience of this is going to be quite unique. But I think physicians have more experience with this technique with people, and for some people it's rather quick, and for some people it's not. I don't think it's an option for caregivers to go. I don't think it's a good path without knowing what those barriers might be with your loved one, as they're going through this process. It can be quite a long process, and people need to be aware of that. I think what this really boils down to for me is that people need to be talking about these things, and they don't need to be afraid to talk about death and the dying process. And I think it really brings an awareness of, how precious every moment is that we have with our health here and our loved ones in our time, but that, we all are going to be facing these choices, and we need to understand what they are, and we need to understand the clinical aspects of death for different diseases. You mentioned cancer. For some patients, cancer can, the pain can be controlled, and for some cancer patients, like if you have bone cancer, it's really, really difficult to get out in front of the pain with those patients. My father died of bone cancer over a decade ago, and he was a member of the Hemlock Society at that point. He was of that generation that really wanted to control things in his life. He had everything set out. He had his living will. He had, everything was set. And he thought that he knew how he was going to die. If he ever got sick enough, he had a plan. And he was not able to execute that plan because he was just so debilitated by this bone cancer and in so much pain. I mean, I couldn't even put a finger on him without him writhing in pain. It was something that really informed my feeling about this issue, and I would not wish that kind of an excruciating, painful death on anybody. Thankfully, we had a hospice nurse who worked with us, and my father ended up dying in a state of palliative sedation. He was in a comatose state at the very end, and she helped him over, and it was we were all just so grateful that she was there to ease his pain. It was incredible. The physicians that I've worked with very closely in this state on this issue have said that between 3% and 5% of deaths are typically not good. They are, if you have ALS, you could be drowning in your own secretions. If you get pneumonia, you literally are drowning. For somebody who has bone cancer, you cannot control that pain. It is pain to the core of your being. Some people may think that having an excruciatingly painful death is something that brings about a religious transformation, and I do not want to diminish that belief for those people, and that's absolutely their choice to make. But for people who don't want to have that kind of a death, they need to have other options, and that is what our Death with Dignity Law, Act 39, gives to people.
When someone has cancer, before they die, it progresses, and that's called metastasizing, right? And so if cancer metastasizes, it goes all through the body. So everybody ends up in the end with bone cancer, don't they?
I don't believe that's the case. I think that if that it can happen, but it doesn't always happen. But cancer deaths they're not pretty.
No.
for most people.
They're not at all, and I'll just mention that I've spoken about my sister. My brother-in-law, her husband, her former husband, at the point where she died, a year after, well, a number of months after her death, he was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in several organs, and within a year of my sister's death, he also had died. So I think I pointing that out just in terms of the obvious, that we all have personal connections with death. And I'm, in your speaking just a few moments ago about how things are evolving, I'm really heartened by the increased discussions and awareness that Oregon has had the law for the greatest length of time, and they have seen their palliative care improve, they've seen hospice. We're seeing this all over. I didn't mention, but I am a hospice volunteer. I sing with the Wellspring singing group in Middlebury, Hospice Volunteer Services. We're under their wing. And so I've continued to be near patients who are in their final period of life. But I am so encouraged by what we hear about and also what's happening here, the concept of discussing death among people in New York City, and it was referred to as a death cafe. I don't necessarily like that title, but I do know that a friend of mine that I used to work with asked if we couldn't start something similar in the Addison County area. And just, for us, it was just a private group of people getting together, but speaking about our end of life and investigating end of life choice and advanced care directives, and really talking about and viewing some videos. And of course, hospice is an excellent resource for viewing various, in their library, various video, DVDs, books that are available. So I'm sharing this because I'm so encouraged that we're having conversations about death and dying. I've done presentations to high school students as well as college students. I know that there's a young woman in our Wellspring singing group who has gone through a January term course at Middlebury College that our Hospice Volunteer Services outreach person, Priscilla Baker, makes that available. And so it's, in my mind, it's so important that not only people who may be of the age that I am, but also of any age, that we are encouraging an increased amount of dialogue around what it is, death and dying, how we'd like it to be, how it is. I think that we're certainly seeing a lot of media out there to inform us, as well as our own personal investigations, and I'm encouraged. I think the baby boomers are not going to be exactly the same as we've seen for many previous generations and decades. We're going to be actively wanting to know. I personally meet with a group of friends once a month, and we talk about issues not solely about death and dying, but just about being this particular portion of our life journey, and things that we're encountering and ways in which we want certain things to happen, but just we're exploring, and you know, we haven't been this age before, so let's learn about it and let's see what we can find out. And so in general, I think that this progression across the country, as various other states are encountering their own citizens' desire to have legislation in place around end-of-life choices. It's clearly happening. I guess that's the obvious. It's happening, and I certainly am not trying to impose on anyone, but I guess this is the educator in me. I worked with young children for more than 30 years, and I always wanted them to be happily investigating, curious about things. And so that curiosity at this point in my life is going to be obviously entailing how I feel and what lies ahead around the end of my life. So just wanted to put that in.
I think I've heard this referred to as the silver tsunami. So, and it is the boomers, coming square into this issue and not being afraid to talk about this, to talk about death and dying.
I'm in a group too where we discuss, everybody's a little older, and but we were discussing a book which I recently was reading about extending life. And there's some research being done and people think that in the future the life expectancy may increase by more than a year every year as you go. So, and that's supposed to happen right about now. So if you increase the life expectancy by a year, every year we get older, that means we could theoretically live forever.
Theoretically.
It's an amazing concept, isn't it?
It's an amazing theory. We'll see how that works out.
Right.
So we were discussing that in my group, and it turned out I said, I thought it was great, that I was all for that. But everybody else in the group said they didn't want to live forever.
Well, it's interesting. There's a new report out called Dying in America, which is really kind of a picture of what the resources are, what people are thinking about this issue. The particular gentleman who wrote this piece is advocating for himself that when he reaches the age of 75, he does not want to have any kind of medical intervention. He doesn't want to have any testing. And I look to my mother who is in her 80s, and she has said, I'm not going for a mammogram because I'm not going to get, I would not opt for chemotherapy and treatment at my age anyway. And it's a silly thing for me to use those medical resources, use them on somebody who's young, who has, a long life ahead of them, and let me live my end days the way I want to. So there is this kind of growing thought that, at a certain point, I'm going to say no to medical interventions and to testing. And that I applaud my mother for her common sense approach to this. Of course, there are people who will, at the age of 98, say, bring everything at me. And, those people certainly have a right to that belief.
True.
And if they can pay for the resources, then that's absolutely fine. I think we just need to be honest about what is truly going to be effective in terms of extending life. And I think it invites us to have that exploration about quality versus quantity.
Right, because that's what it is. I don't think I mentioned specifically, but that was my sister's thought. She had 2 children who, they're grown adults, but she didn't want to hasten her life in order, she didn't want to get away from them. She wanted more time with them, but she was realistic about how compromised she was. And for her, the quality of her life, of not being able to do anything in terms of muscle movement, that was too compromised for her, and not what. And she was diagnosed within 6 months of dying. So, but it's as we each need to have a little dialogue with ourselves at an age where we can be competent in doing that and think about, okay, so what, and I think all of this discussion that is now present is doing that. It's causing us to say, okay, so for me, quality of life, how compromised would I, if my brain was able to be competently thinking that way, how far would I wish to extend my life?
Right.
So.
And everybody's got a different point. And that's the whole thing, is that this is a personal choice. And it's a personal choice that you make with your family, and with your physician. And, having that exploration. And for some people who may think that they want this option, after they explore what their particular disease process looks like, they may decide, I don't really need this. This is not something that I want. And that's absolutely wonderful. Because they're making that choice about controlling their death and what their death is going to look like, and that their death and the dying process is going to be something that reflects their values as a living human being.
I think the data shows that more than half the people who get the prescription don't use it. So it's a security more than it is definite to be used.
I think it's a little less than half. But,
Listen,
yeah,
But,
yes.
but still, and I will say, because of my strong advocacy relative to this, there are many people in my Middlebury realm that when this was passed, it became law, May 20th, 2013, constantly afterward, I heard from people, thank you, because of the fact that they felt a greater assurance of control as we move forward, and that they could indeed have access to. But it's that comfort level of being assured that that this joins other choices that one might make, but that it is available.
I think that's the most important point to remember, is that there is a comfort in knowing that you have all of these options, and that you can look at these options and discuss them with the medical community, with your doctor, with your hospice caregivers. You can have this conversation and decide what's right for you. And knowing that you have this full range of choices is a comfort for many, many people. Whether they use it or not is really, for them, it's not necessarily the relevant piece of information. It's just knowing that it's there.
For me, if I were within 6 months of death, I would ask for the prescription right away. And then I'd set it on my shelf and then leave security that if things got too bad, I'd have a way out. But I wouldn't necessarily use it.
I think that's what we saw in,
Yes.
In Oregon. That was a pretty common thing. I think that given the environment we live in today, with opiate abuse happening and people breaking into homes, and with the relative expense of this prescription, I think it might be wise to have that conversation about when you actually need to fill the prescription, that having it sitting around may not be something that you want to do. You might want to wait until once you have the prescription, that's fine, but have it filled when you think that you're a little closer to making that decision, and not just sitting around. It is a big concern that these things could be very, very harmful for a healthy person to get their hands on. And
Well, the prescription is pentobarbital, isn't it?
for some, it is.
That's not like heroin. Nobody can get high on that.
Well, but you could accidentally ingest it, and it could be very harmful. I mean, I think that the big deal is that you want to make sure that you are following all the precautions with any of these pharmaceutical agents, because they could potentially be very harmful. They're all titrated to your particular disease and your height and your weight, and
Right.
You have to be very, very careful with these things, and you want to make sure that that they don't get into the wrong hands, and that if you decide not to use it, that is just disposed of appropriately. And there are DEA rules on how that happens.
Right.
So I think it really is important to, part of the thinking process is to try to understand, well, at what point do I think I might want to, I know it's my right, and I'm going to go through the process, and I'm going to get the prescription. At what point do I think I might want to use it? And really try to understand when that might be, and then have the prescription filled at that point. There are a number of other agents that other physicians have used in Oregon. Pentobarbital is the most commonly used. Barbiturates are the most commonly used form of a drug, but there are others used as well. And so, you really just need to understand what the particular person is going through, and what other drugs they may be taking for pain control. And that's why it's really important that you work with the doctor on this, that you have that really, in the weeds clinical understanding of the interaction of all of these things. And so.
Let's see, is there, what's the difference between, some people talk about euthanasia and suicide when they think of death with dignity. What's the difference between euthanasia and death with dignity?
Well, it's really semantics as far as I'm concerned. In Vermont law, assisting a suicide is still illegal, but this particular act by law is not deemed suicide. It is deemed hastening of your death, because you're already dying. You already have a terminal illness, and you are making this choice to hasten your death. So it's a very specific legal definition, and depending on how people feel about it, there descriptive language around it is going to tell you whether they're opposed or in favor of it. So euthanasia really is where somebody else makes that decision, and it's what we do with our pets. When our pets are sick and too sick and we know that they don't have a good quality of life, we put them down, and that's euthanasia. Assisting a suicide is when you actually actively help someone to kill themselves who otherwise would have a normally healthy life. So they don't have that diagnosis of a terminal illness. And so it's a very legally prescribed set of conditions that you have to meet to have immunity under the law and to be in a position where you can avail yourself of the law. And at that point, it's not considered suicide.
I think caregivers have to be a little bit careful about what they recommend to their patients. For instance, if someone appears to them to be close to death, but they don't have a definite diagnosis, they wouldn't want to advise the patient in any way?
Well, you have to have a diagnosis and a prognosis. So without those two things, you really cannot avail yourselves of the law.
But what happens if the nurse tells her patient about the law and advises them to go and get a diagnosis?
I don't know what would happen under those conditions. A physician would have to diagnose the patient with some terminal illness, and then a second physician would have to confirm that.
But there's a slippery area there where someone could get into trouble if they think that someone needs to make use of the law and they advise them. If they're not a physician or if the person doesn't have the diagnosis. Have there been any cases?
No, there have not been any cases where anybody has really encouraged or, where there's been an abuse situation around encouraging someone to use the law. There's a real difference between advising somebody of what their options are under the law, which we actually require in the Vermont law, and saying, oh, I think you should go do this. That, there's a line you cross when you say, I think you should go do this. But providing that information, that basic information about what people's rights are under the law is a very neutral act, and it can be a whole range of options that people have to look at, including hospice care, palliative care, and so you really need to make sure that you are providing information and that patients can ask questions about each of these things and not be pushed into making one choice over another, but to make a choice based on their own values and what they expect of the dying process for themselves.
So some people think that the European system, for instance, in Switzerland, they would say that was euthanasia. You've heard that, right?
I have, yes.
But there's a confusion of semantics there that
Right.
Euthanasia sort of implies that you're putting down your dog.
Right,
The dog doesn't get a choice in that.
right,
But in Switzerland, that would be actually illegal. That's not
Right.
what their law provides.
right.
The law requires that a person make the choice, and it actually does have the safeguards that you have to see two doctors and make it very clear that what the patient actually wants.
Right.
So it's not really fair when people criticize the European law as being euthanasia.
Right, true. Although in Belgium, they recently extended their law to include children, and so parents can make that choice for their children who are dying of a terminal illness. And so in that case, it's really not because you're not of legal age to make that choice in and of itself. It does go beyond the bounds of what we are able to do in this country. And so, those kinds of things kind of lead people into more expansive language to describe what's going on. I would not want to see my child suffer needlessly. We all would like to see our loved ones live on and on and on, but that's not the way of the world. And so I think, admitting, first of all, we're all going to die, and, exploring what do we want that to look like is really an important thing. Making that choice for someone else is a whole nother ball of wax. I'm not so sure I'm ready to make that decision for somebody else.
Well, if you're a parent and you make the decision with your doctor, two doctors, for instance, it's likely to be a good decision. And
Right.
some children might be in severe pain and actually be in need of the law.
Right. And my guess is that they're probably children who were pretty close to dying anyway, and they really are hastening the death and not doing it when the child is still, vibrant and active, and they may have a terminal illness, but they're not very close to death at that point. So.
In Belgium, there was a case of two twins, I think, and they were both deaf and unable to speak, and they were going blind. And they made a decision, and in that situation, they would be totally locked within their bodies, but they could live for many years.
Right.
So they made a decision to end their lives. And that was held up as a terrible thing by the people who were against death with dignity.
Right.
But it seems to me that they had the right to make that decision, and it's not an unreasonable choice. People would say, well, they were depressed, but maybe some depression is legitimate, and in their situation, it's kind of understandable that they might be depressed.
True.
Mm-hmm. Very true.
So personally, I would like to see our law extended to include, be more like the Europeans. And I'm happy that Quebec has seen it to do that.
It's one step at a time. I think, what we're seeing, particularly in New England, there's legislation that's been introduced in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. There's legislation that is pending in New Jersey as well. And the polling numbers are showing that more and more people are in favor of having this option. Even if they're not going to use it, they're in favor of having the option. I think until we really get a little further along with more states participating, and we have the data that shows that there aren't abuse, that we have the safeguards in place to make sure that people are making these decisions of their own volition, it's always going to be a tricky thing. I think we are at the cusp of moving forward in a number of states on this issue, and it will be, I think, a very different conversation 20 years from now.
You mentioned the cost of the medicine. Is the prescription very expensive?
Pentobarbital, the compounding prescription is about between $300 and $400. Prior to pentobarbital, the physicians out in Oregon were using Seconal, and that got to be very, very expensive, which is why they started looking at the pentobarbital. And there are other compounds that physicians have used out in Oregon as well. In Vermont, we don't collect any data on what the prescription is. We don't collect any data on the demographics of the people. It's once the decision is made and we've determined that there's no abuse or coercion, it is strictly a private affair. Physicians do have to fill out the form and send it to the Department of Health and say, yes, this person qualified, and I am writing the prescription, but that's the point where the state steps back out of the situation, and it becomes a really private affair with the person and their doctor and their caregivers and their family. So we don't have the ability to understand what other prescriptions might be used. Doctors, however, talk to themselves a lot, and they set up their own networks, and they, can educate each other on this issue. And we do hope that over time that those networks will be highly functional within the state, and that physicians will understand what they can do, what they should do, what the costs of these things are. We are really at the infant stage in terms of having that network set up here in Vermont. So it will take some time.
I would think this is something the Vermont Health Department could work on. According to this book, pentobarbital, also called Nembutal, is the worldwide standard for use. And using something else may be motivated by religious considerations or we don't know what, but it would be to everybody's benefit if the best drug were used, and that might be written into the law, what drug to use.
Well, I think it's going to vary depending on the person. If you have a person who's never taken an opiate before, you could give them a very high dose of an opiate and it will do the same thing. But people who've been taking pain medications that are morphine-based, opiate-based, are going to have, the receptors are going to be flooded, and so they're not going to respond in the same way that what we would call an opiate version might respond. So different people, depending on their diagnosis, I think are going to require a different treatment, and we do leave that up to the physicians to determine what that is. There are also new drugs coming onto the market all the time, so we need to be aware that, you know, when you write something into the law, you're going to have to go back and tinker with that every time something new comes out, or there's a condition where a physician really feels that they need to go outside of what you've said in statute. So I really do advocate for not prescribing what physicians should do, that physicians will understand that themselves and be able to make those choices in conjunction with their patients.
Why is the drug so expensive?
Well, we don't manufacture it here anymore, which is one of the problems. When Seconal was the drug of choice, it was being made in the United States, and at that point, the dose again was $300 to $400. That company sold the process to a company out of India, and at that point, the price went from $400 to over $1,800 for the prescription. So we had to, you know, it had to be imported, and then it was very expensive, and it was hard to get. That was when physicians started moving to the pentobarbital. The pentobarbital, again, is not made in this country, it's made in the European Union. So some of the issues around states that have death penalty, for instance, might cause the European Union to say we're not going to send to that state because they also have the death penalty, and we don't approve of that being used for that purpose. So, you know, it gets complicated. There are all these trade barriers as well. We know that there are companies in China that make this very broadly, but we may not have the trade system set up with those countries to obtain the drug from them. So it gets very, very complicated. You start having to get into FDA compliance issues and trade issues. So, you know, it's a very complicated thing, and physicians have to be very careful about, you know, understanding what is available for their patients.
That might be something the legislature could influence, though. You could create some sort of incentive to set up a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility in Vermont to manufacture for this market.
That would be very interesting. You know, we really don't anticipate having more than 12 to 15 patients a year using this drug. So I don't know that it would be a profitable venture. Let me put it that way. If the numbers bear out, comparing both Washington State and Oregon State, the numbers of people who use death with dignity there compared to the overall population, to compare to the population of dying citizens, we really don't expect to have a huge number here in Vermont. So, you know, 12 to 15 is what we think when it's fully implemented and available. That's really what we'll be looking at here.
That's a pretty small number.
It is, very.
But with many citizens who are grateful that the law exists for their own comfort and security. So we may not be high in numbers of actual ingesters and persons who hasten the end of their death, but we do have a citizenry that is grateful, I believe.
And believes that this is a right, and they have been
Yes.
really incredible advocates for this law and are very interested in making sure that it stays the law in Vermont.
Last year, I think there were 265 prescriptions written in Oregon, and 171 actually used. And they have a population of, they had 180,000 deaths. So it's a small
It's a very
portion.
Very
of the
small
Right.
portion
Deaths.
when you look at the number of deaths.
But still, 265 prescriptions,
Right.
it might be worth manufacturing the drug for.
In Oregon, it might.
Not here.
Not Vermont.
But we're close enough to Quebec that we could provide the,
Possibly, we'd have to check with our
With those trade.
our federal delegation to understand what the trade restrictions are. So,
well, it's an idea.
yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, we didn't hear too much about Patient Choices Vermont. Would you like to tell us more about the organization?
Well, the passage of this law came about because of the decade-long efforts of citizens here in this state who wanted to see this particular legislation be signed into law and provide the rights of those who wish to take advantage of it. I believe that, and from my perspective and that of the organization, our job is not over simply because we now have that law. We are working to continue advocating, protecting, informing, and I'm just so grateful for the number of citizens in this state who are aware of Patient Choices Vermont and are part of our active body of advocates, protecting the law, protecting the rights of the citizens. That continues to be why we're in existence. The Compassion and Choice Society, with the work they're doing in specifically overseeing the use of the law, that's not going to be what Patient Choices is working on, because we have this very capable organization that is able to work with our Department of Health. And so Patient Choices Vermont continues to exist. We're continuing to be active. We're not blind to the fact that there happen to be people within the state who are opposed to this legislation, and a portion of the law does sunset in 2016. For my personal opinion, I wish to have the law stay in pretty much the form that it's in right now, because the portion that is set to sunset happens to contain the specific requirements, procedures, and protections for the patient. And what would go forward would be the patient, physician working out all out on their own. And I agree with Linda every time that we've both mentioned about the relationship that a patient should have with their physician, and that we should be having this discussion early and so forth. But I also believe so strongly that the portion of the current law that outlines specific procedure, specific protections, that needs to stay in the law, in my opinion, and it's one of the reasons I continue my advocacy work with Patient Choices Vermont, because we feel that's the most important thing, that we protect the law and protect the right of the citizen who wish to have that potentially as an end-of-life choice.
So does that mean that you would be opposed to going to the European system?
I certainly am not saying that this law needs to contain its exact, I think, as Linda said, I think we're in the beginning stages and we will be evolving. But I believe that the law we have now, with its specific outlines, is the best for right now. And as we move forward, and I totally agree with what you've mentioned. I'm working in Vermont because this is where I live, but I feel, and I'm so encouraged and heartened by the fact that others in other states are also wanting this type of legislation to be in there. I want every state, my dream list is every state, and my complete dream list would be that every citizen, every human being have end-of-life choices, and that this be one of them, that you could hasten the end of your life if you are terminally ill and within 6 months of dying and competent.
I sat through the debate in the Senate last year, and I remember one of the issues was all these protections, and one of the senators spoke up and said, well, that's like making the dying patient jump through all these hoops in order to get what they should be entitled to. And so personally, I would like to be rid of some of the protections. I think it's overprotected.
Well, at some point, I think, too, this will become a bona fide, medical practice. It'll become, something that physicians can say, I can rely on this. I don't know that 2 years is going to get us to that point. I mean, we may need to work on this a little bit longer than a 2-year period to really have our physicians feel secure in prescribing, because the best way to undermine this law is for physicians to say, I'm not going to participate because I don't feel protected. I don't feel like I have immunity under the law because it's not explicitly stated what people have to do and how they're eligible. So I think that that's a really big consideration. I think we all want to be able to make this decision privately with our physicians and not have
Yes.
the government, stepping in and interfering with that. But I think that, the people who are opposed to this legislation often point to the potential for abuse, for people to be coerced into making this choice when it's really not their own free will. Maybe it's family members who want them to, just not be a burden or whatever those reasons might be. I would just want to make sure that we have protections in place so that people do not go into this conversation or into this request feeling like people are pressuring them to do
Right.
it. It has to be of your own free will. And I think giving that 15-day period where you have a couple of physicians talking to you about this, where you have these conversations going on, really gives the time to have that exploration and for the physicians to really know that, yes, this is what this person wants, that I do not suspect that they've got a family member pushing them to make this decision. So I think, it's kind of a fine line on, I think Vermont came up with an interesting bill in that we said, once you get to that point, the state steps out and it becomes that private decision, and that person decides whether they're going to have the prescription filled, whether they're going to take it. And the state does not follow
Right.
that information. So I think it's a really interesting kind of hybrid that we came up with. I just want to make sure that physicians are feeling secure in what we have in the law, that they are going to continue to prescribe. And I think that's where we have to ask physicians to inform us of what their thinking is as we move into this next legislative session, to understand what their concerns are and to listen to them very closely and to respect that. If we need to go in and tinker with the law, then we should be respectful and do that, because otherwise, if it's not accessible, it's not meaningful, and then it's going to be difficult for anybody to find a physician to work with. So. Double-edged sword.
Yes. Did we cover all the points here?
Well, I think one thing that I would like to say is one of the things that Compassion and Choices provides is free end-of-life consultation. And we do this for patients who have already been diagnosed with a terminal illness. They may live in a death with dignity state, they may not, but we do provide that consultation. We help people think about advance directives. We make sure people understand what their rights are if they have Alzheimer's, and the whole dementia provision, and what we call the Ulysses Clause as part of the advance directive. And the whole idea of advance care planning is just really integral to what this organization does. And so, people can call our 800 number, which is 1-800-247-7421. And ask for this information. And depending on where you live, you can get a package sent to you. If you are actively trying to sort through your medical options, we have trained counselors who can work with you and your family members to help you sort through that. It can be really daunting to try to understand the medical gobbledygook that may be coming at you when you're at this point. You're trying to make this decision about what you want in your life. And I think there was a recent study done that showed that when somebody used a verbal description of a medical procedure, there was a different choice made than when somebody saw a video of what the actual medical procedure was. So, making sure that people really truly understand what's being said to them, and maybe even translating that into the visual for people so that because the last thing you want is for somebody to say, no, this is not what I wanted, and to be able to make that informed decision is really, really important. So I think we need to, it's just one of the best things that I think this organization provides, is that kind of down in the weeds understanding and help with people as they're sorting through these different medical options.
You have a website too.
We
they can
do.
go to.
www.compassionandchoices.org. You can go to the main page, and depending on where you live, you can click on the state that you live in, and it will take you to information about what's available in that state. For Vermonters, we have a lot more available because we are a Death with Dignity state, so there's a lot more information about your options there. But in addition, picking up the phone and calling that 800 number can be really helpful as well.
And Patient Choices has a website too, right?
Yes, they do, a very fine one, and that is www.patientchoices.org. And if you simply want to Google Patient Choices Vermont, it comes up readily, and it has information, prior news or current news as well, of course, and it's very informative and very, very available.
For our viewers that are interested, I would recommend this book, In Search of Gentle Death, The Fight for Your Right to Die with Dignity, written by Richard N. Cote. It covers the whole international situation, including Australia and Switzerland, and there's some very interesting activity in Australia and Switzerland and other parts of the world. But I'm glad that we're progressing here in Vermont.
Absolutely.
I am too. I'm thrilled to be able to, and honored to be able to be an advocate for this choice.
And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be part of this here and in general.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your coming, joining us. I'll ask each one of you, if anyone were to come to you and ask your opinion on the topic, how would you put it in one sentence?
I think that my one sentence would be that it is the individual person's right of choice, and there is plenty of information available to assist you in exploring this opportunity. Long sentence, but
Well, that's okay.
Yeah. My exact sentiment, I would say that this is a personal choice, and I would not want to make that choice for you, and I would hope that you would not want to make that choice for me.
And I'll propose a slightly shorter sentence. All people deserve to make their own personal end-of-life decisions from a full range of choices for dying in comfort, dignity, and control. And I'm reading that from
And you're reading that.
I was going to say, that sounds familiar.
from the website.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess we're running out of time here, so I want to thank you both for coming. And
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you,
It's
Terry.
really an honor to be here.
for our viewers at home, I'll be back with another episode of Vermont Today next month, and I want to thank you for tuning in, and hope you'll tune in again next month too. Thank you.
Before you take the medication, I'm going to ask you these two questions again.
Sure.
You have the right to change your mind.
My mind's not changing.
And what will this medication do?
It will kill me and make me happy.
Death with dignity. The other side calls it assisted suicide.
I was diagnosed with cancer. I was supposed to have 6 months.
Hi, Sue. These people have lost so much control, and they'll tell us repeatedly they want the medication for control.
It's this curious limbo. You don't know what's really going to happen, except with Death with Dignity, you do have some control over what's going to happen.
An online survey of physicians showed 50% in favor, 42% against.
We have a tradition in this country to allow patients to deny care, but we've never allowed physicians to actively take somebody's life. That's not the practice of medicine.
First do no harm is going to be different for every patient.
So how are you feeling?
Harm for some patients is saying, no, 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 you've got to do this the way your body decides as opposed to the way you decide.
My son has a little trouble with this.
She says the cancer's come back, I have 6 months to live, and things are going to be fine. That sounds like the opposite of fine.
If I'm in that bed and I'm racked up with a stroke, that's what I want. That's the decent thing to do. So So for once in my life, I'll be decent.
If I had an option, I would prefer not to die. Thank you very much.
The Oregon law has been thoroughly tested. Now it's time to get it going in other states.
I just think a society has to be asked, is this what we really want?
My husband did not feel that any government or any religious leader had the right to tell him how long he had to suffer.
I understand there's a kind of dignity in suffering, but there's a certain grace in accepting the inevitable. I can't do anymore.
I think all of us would like to have some options of how we'd take control of our life at the end.